All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Knowles, and I'm the project manager of the Lower Columbia River Integrated DMP and EIS. We also have various members of the Army Corps of Engineers, sponsor ports, and Anchor QEA on the call this evening. Welcome to the open house. The purpose of this meeting is to update the public on the planning process for the Lower Columbia River Integrated DMP and EIS, or otherwise called the report. In 2017, this project went through the public scoping phase under the name Lower Columbia River Channel Maintenance Plan, or the LCR-CMP. This is the same project, it's just had a slight name update. We'll be covering the schedule of releasing the draft report for public comment, and time permitting, as Kim mentioned, we will be having a facilitated question and answer session with some questions being able to be answered, throughout the presentation. The Army Corps of Engineers is the lead agency under NEPA. The ports of Longview, Kalama, Woodlands, Vancouver, and Portland are the sponsor ports of this project. They also act as cooperating agencies under NEPA. The Washington ports are co-lead agencies under SEPA, with the Port of Longview as the lead agency. We'll be discussing NEPA and SEPA a little bit later in the presentation. As I mentioned, we have 5 sponsor ports in both Oregon and Washington, and these sponsors are considered part of the team for the development of the report, as well as responsible for compliance with SEPA on the Washington side. Together, the sponsor ports are the non-federal cost share partner who are responsible for procuring new upland placement sites to support the ongoing maintenance of the federal navigation channel. I'm going to walk through the core study process a little bit here, and it begins with scoping. The scoping effort was completed for this project in 2017. Public input was received at this stage. The team dove into a data gathering and began the environmental coordination. We are currently in the alternative formulation and analysis phase, which is that dark blue arrow, where we are evaluating the alternatives. This process will be covered in more detail later in the slides. The next step is to release the draft report to public for review. The draft report is scheduled to be released for public review in November of this year, and this will include further refinement of the recommended plan, revision to the ESA BIOP requirements, and releasing the final report. The final stage for this report is Corps approval. The final report goes to the Army Corps of Engineers Northwestern Division for approval, and then we will receive the NEPA record of decision, as well as ensure and other environmental compliance actions are completed and SEPA adoption. I understand there's a lot of interest in the sites that we will be selecting as part of this plan, and I'm anticipating some folks to be concerned of whether or not their site or their property is located in our plan right now. This third arrow here, the release draft report to public, is where we will be releasing that information, not at this meeting today. So today's presentation is really just to focus on providing an update and discussing next steps. I'll pause here to see if there are any questions so far.
No questions yet, Sarah. Just a reminder, if folks have joined since we began, there is a Q&A button in the bottom right-hand corner. You can submit a question there. We do have some comments that are being posted, and we will preserve those, as we noted, as part of the Q&A record being saved for these meetings. But at this time, no specific questions.
Thank you. Okay, moving into some background here. The Lower Columbia River project was originally authorized by Congress in 1878 with a 20-foot minimum depth of the federal navigation channel. And as you can see listed on the slide, there have been several deepening efforts and authorizations to include also widening the navigation channel. Back in 1999, the channel was deepened to 43 feet deep and 600 feet wide to also include ecosystem restoration features. And today, we are still maintaining the nav channel at 43 feet deep. The project area of the DMP covers the Columbia River from River Mile 3 to 105.5, which is roughly Astoria to Vancouver. The river is split up into reaches, which are then divided into segments. Each reach is about 3 to 4 segments. And on the right side of the screen, you'll see numbered reaches with the named segments associated with it. The left side of the screen shows where these segments are located on a map, with each segment being a different color. In order to develop the plan, the team has to consider the details in each segment, as well as how they interact on a larger, more system-wide scale. And study authority. The Corps first received congressional authority to maintain the Columbia and Lower Willamette rivers in the Rivers and Harbors Act of the years listed here, the Water Resources Development Act of 1999, and the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2004. The engineering regulation 1105-2-11 requires DMMPs where there's an indication of insufficient placement capacity to continue maintenance activities for 20 years. And this insufficient placement capacity is determined by the preliminary assessment, which I'll discuss here in just a moment. I'll have another quick pause and turn it to Kim, see if there's any questions.
No additional questions at this time. So again, just remind folks if there's some that are joining, there is a Q&A button in the bottom right-hand corner with a question mark icon. Let's see, we do have a comment now that just came in. I'll go ahead and read that. I have worked with the Corps and the ports since the original dredge plan starting in the 90s, and it is extremely frustrating getting any traction with the Corps. I complete all the paperwork, and if you could tell me if I was chosen as a site or not, it would be very beneficial.
Thanks, Kim, for the question. As I mentioned, we will not be talking through what specific sites are in the recommended plan at this meeting, but by the time we get to that draft report release in November, we'll be able to contact the impacted landowners and notify them of whether or not sites are selected.
Thanks, Sarah. We don't have any other questions right now.
Okay, thank you. So moving into the Corps planning process, discussion on the preliminary assessment, which I will call the PA from here on out. Why are we going through the process now? The existing dredge material placement sites are nearing capacity, and space is needed for the estimated 6 to 8 million cubic yards of material to be dredged every year. The PA recommended a new DMMP to ensure that we have sufficient capacity moving into the future. And this was posted on the Corps' website back in 2017. We expect the DMMP to operate in a budget-constrained environment and are seeking innovative and creative solutions in order to do so. We'll also be looking into new approaches to channel maintenance, looking to regional sediment management, informed dredging and placement, working environmental compliance on a programmatic level, and improving utilization of the existing equipment. In partnership with the sponsor ports and with input from other stakeholders and the public, the Corps will determine the best management plan for upland and in-water dredge material placement. We're evaluating ways to reduce dredging requirements and considering impacts to the natural resources of the Lower Columbia. The Corps and sponsor ports are also evaluating alternatives and environmental effects in a joint EIS, and will select the preferred management plan based on this analysis. And once this is all completed, the plan will help define the next 20 years of channel maintenance on the Lower Columbia River. Why is it important to maintain the navigation channel? The preliminary assessment economic analysis identified that we do have a federal interest, and here are some reasons why. So first off, every year we see over 50 million tons of cargo worth $24 billion moving through the Columbia Snake River navigation system. And the cost to maintain the authorized channel dimensions is only $43 million compared to that $24 billion that we are seeing move through it. And the Lower Columbia River is nationally significant in that we are #1 in the United States for wheat export. We are #2 in soy and corn export, #3 largest grain export in the world, and we're #1 on the West Coast for forest and mineral bulk export. Over $1 billion was invested by the port since the deepening of the channel in 2010 and increases in the metric tons of cargo, both imported and exported for ports of call. So this is a very vital gateway for the global trade to continue as a national priority into this future. The big takeaway from this slide is that the planning process is iterative. So as you see, there's a circle here on the slide, and we continue to walk around the circle as we walk through the process. So we begin at the top with evidence gathering and scoping. We then move to the plan formulation, which is where we're at now with a specific project. And then we move into some more evidence gathering. And as new evidence is identified, we incorporate that into the plan. And sometimes that may push us back to scoping. And then we gather data and then incorporate. And as we move around this circle, we're continually assessing and managing risk, as well as involving stakeholders and ensuring the core vertical team is aligned. Part of this planning process is to identify problems. A couple are listed here. And the first is that sediment movement, shoaling, and sand waves cause portions of the nav channel to be less than the authorized depth of 43 feet for portions of any given year. And if the channel is not available at the authorized depth, there are commercial draft restrictions, commercial ship draft restrictions. Dredging equipment in the existing fleet of dredge vessels have limitations and impact the operation and maintenance of the Lower Columbia River Channel. Current placement sites are at or nearing capacity. Sedimentation and shoaling rates vary each year, making it difficult to accurately estimate annual dredging needs to support budget requests. Pile dikes, islands, and other channel training structures are not functioning efficiently or even effectively in various locations throughout the project. And real estate is in scarce supply to find land for additional placement sites. The planning process also identifies opportunities and constraints. So some opportunities are identifying potential in-water confined disposal sites and new upland disposal sites. We'll also identify optimum dredging equipment for shoal to guide the implementation of the 20-year plan. We'll identify optimum placement options per shoal to inform the capital cost, and identify suitable economic and environmental beneficial uses for the dredge material, including habitat creation of the opportunities with the use of dredge placement. Some constraints that were identified is that the dredge fleet remains the same. We'll be constrained to use the existing core dredging vessels, the hopper dredges, as well as the dredge organ. The equipment safety limitations are related to water depth, river flow, and sea conditions that cannot be violated. Therefore, it's limiting in what dredging equipment can safely perform work at various dredging, transfer, and placement sites. And I'll cover what transfer and placement sites look like a little bit later in the presentation. We also cannot translocate shoaling problems from the federal navigation channel to adjacent non-federal infrastructure, such as marinas, ship berths, and facilities. We have four main objectives of the project. Number one is to identify adequate suite of placement locations, investigate beneficial use opportunities. As I mentioned, that could be either economic or environmental. Identify options for reducing reliance on dredging as a channel maintenance method, and identifying dredge equipment resources that improve maintenance and efficiencies.
We do have a question that came in. It's related to the interaction between this project and others in the river. So I'll read it now. Are there any projected dredging impacts, if any, of the Lower Columbia River on the Lower Columbia River, if any dams are removed?
The question is, if dams were removed, would we have dredging implications?
Yes.
I would say yes, but that would definitely be outside of the scope of this specific project. And I would assume that would be a full study that would happen if the dam were to be removed on the Columbia River.
Thank you, Sarah. There aren't any other questions at this time, but I will just take a moment, since we've had a couple of new attendees join, to let folks know that participants are muted and have video off, but are able to submit questions using the icon in the bottom right-hand corner. So if you do have any questions as we work through the presentation, we'll take an opportunity as we have time to ask those. Otherwise, this log will be posted after the meeting. But nothing further right now, Sarah.
All right, thank you. Okay, so moving into channel maintenance practices. We, like I mentioned, maintain the channel to 43 feet deep. And different shoals occur within nearly every mile. And the shoals, again, are within the reaches of the project site. We maintain the channel using a combination of channel training features and dredging. And currently we dredge 6 to 8 million cubic yards of sand every year. And this is all relative to fixed low water datum in the Columbia River, which is generally the lowest observed water level that occur at a location. It's not 43 feet below the water surface at any given moment. And so if the water level is greater than the thickness of sand deposition in the channel, the ships will have enough water depth to pass over the top of the sand deposit. And that's shown in this little diagram at the bottom of the slide. And if there are lower river levels, a ship cannot pass over this sand deposit if it's not removed. And then ships will be just restricted and not be able to pass. And I mentioned this a couple of times, the authorized navigation channel depth is 43 feet below the zero datum, which is roughly the river level at a minimum operating discharge from Bonneville Dam. All right, what is a shoal? We have condition surveys of the channel of the depth of the river bottom every 30 days or so to look for shoaling. And these depths are relative to the low water datum, not the actual water surface. Shoals are sand deposits that are shallower than the authorized channel depth of 43 feet, shown here as the red areas. Sand waves, or intermittent shoaling, which is shown on the top of the figure, is when the sandy river bottom in the channel forms into giant ripples and the tops of those sand waves get shallower than the authorized channel depth. And then there's a cutline shoal, which is the continuous shoaling you see at the bottom of your screen. And this happens when material moves into the channel from the side slope. Some locations along the river develop shoals multiple times a year, others maybe once a year or every few years. And it's important to note that the material in the lower Columbia River navigation channel has been tested and is all clean, mostly coarse grained sand. A little bit more on sand waves here. This is a neat diagram to show that we don't actually dredge the entire channel, we just dredge the peaks. So a hopper dredge will come along and remove the material above the black line shown here in this figure. And I've been mentioning that we dredge to 43 feet deep, as that's our authorized channel. This is showing the black line at 44 feet, and that's due to advanced maintenance dredging, which we are authorized for up to 5 feet. Now this slide shows the 4 dredges we typically see out in the Columbia River for channel maintenance. The 100+ miles of channel are mostly shoals with sand waves, and the pipeline dredges like the Dredge Oregon, the one in the top left corner, cannot remove sand waves, shoals quickly. To remove these sand waves, we need to use the hopper dredges, which are the other 3 dredges shown here. However, there are a limited number of hopper dredges available nationally. West Coast projects include the Lower Columbia River, have enough routine maintenance dredging work to require and support 3 hopper dredges each year. The government dredges, the Essayance and Yaquina, the 2 on the right-hand side of your screen, and 1 contract hopper dredge. All of these hopper dredges are regional resources, so there could be times that dredging is needed in the Lower Columbia River, but a hopper dredge is not readily available because it's being used to meet the needs of another port district or even another project within Portland District. Hopper dredges are not interchangeable, so the smallest dredge, Yaquina, is the best suited for small sand waves with close in-water placement areas, while larger dredges like the Essayance and most contractor hopper dredges we see, they're better suited for larger volume shoals and need deeper areas to safely place material. It takes the pipeline dredge Oregon and all 3 hopper dredges working together to maintain the channel every year. Currently, the Lower Columbia River project represents a significant portion of the annual workload of each hopper dredge, the Essayance, Yaquina, and the West Coast contract. And since these are regional resources, decisions about the Lower Columbia River channel maintenance can have major effects on how the Corps manages all hopper dredging on the West Coast, including 2 core dredges, which will affect other West Coast projects. In order to plan for dredging and dredge material management for the next 20 years, we need to consider the actual dredge equipment available and how this project fits into the greater regional need. Moving into placement site types now. What you see on the screen here is an upland site. And you'll see the dredge Oregon in the background with the pipeline both floating and submerged in the water. And the sand is pumped ashore to the designated disposal location. We then have upland crews ensure the area is graded so the water and material can settle at the other end. And you can see the pooling here in the photo. In-water shallow placement sites are placement sites that occur in less than 20 feet deep. Materials placed by pipeline or by hopper pump out, and it's pumped to the site directly from a shoal or from a transfer site. These sites have a potential for creating or improving shallow water habitat. The figure to the right on this slide shows how the shallow water placement site works. So the top drawing highlights the shore, the shallow water zone, the deep water zone, and the navigation channel. And as you can see in the middle figure, the gravity bedload movement eventually changes these shallow areas into deep water areas over time. And the idea with shallow water placement is for the dredge material to be placed in a manner to replenish these shallow water zones. Shoreline placement activities are similar to upland activities with the exception that it's along the shoreline. We also create berms for the return water to settle to reduce turbidity before entering the main channel again. And you can see the berm on the left-hand side of the screen, and it's much smaller on the right-hand side of the screen, the aerial photo. And transfer sites. Why do we need transfer or rehandle sites? They are needed where the distance from the upland or shoreline or shallow water site to the nearest shoal or dredge location exceeds the physical pipeline length of the dredge organ to pump it out. So basically, we have a dredge location and a placement site that are too far for the dredge organ to actually reach. So dredge material is temporarily placed in water in the rehandle or transfer site to clear the shoaling quickly, and then later, that material will be pumped out into the final placement site. So how do you reduce the amount of shoaling in the channel? We use channel training structures. Pile dikes and dredge material fill have been added to create a narrower river cross-section that helps prevent sand from depositing in the navigation channel. Pile dikes and dredge material, timber pile dikes increase velocities in the channel to prevent sand from depositing there and decrease velocities at the shore to reduce erosion. So they help hold the channel in and they keep it maintained. And it's a little bit hard to see on screen, but you'll see the top part of this figure, the pre-pile dikes and fill. The survey here, the water depths are much shallower than what you see in the post pile dikes and fill figure at the bottom. So it's almost a self-flushing system where we do not have to dredge as much as other areas. I'll pause here, see if there's questions.
Thanks, Sarah. We don't have any new questions noted at this time.
All right. All right, so earlier in this presentation, I briefly discussed the core study process. This figure shows the planning process in more detail and specific to this project. And I'll go into a little more detail on each of these steps in the next slides. But really, to begin with the integrated DMMP and EIS process, we started with initial management measures, identifying what those would be, and then we screened some of them. After we screened the measures, we developed alternative strategies, and then a final array of measures, which then turned into an initial array of alternatives. After some refinement and analysis, we developed a final array of alternatives and then a draft recommended plan. At the bottom here, you'll see the final steps in the process. After the recommended plan is released, we will have a concurrent review of the integrated DMMP and EIS. As I mentioned, this is expected to be released at the end of this calendar year. We are soliciting feedback on the draft recommended plan from both public, agency, technical, policy, and legal. We will then optimize and refine the agency recommended plan, landing with the identification and selection of the recommended plan. The initial management measures included were both structural and non-structural. And these were developed during the scoping process, charrettes, workshops, and the value engineering study. Screening of the measures were based on planning objectives and constraints, which I spoke about earlier in the slides, technical feasibility, and whether the measure has been carried out already. And these are a handful of questions we asked ourselves when walking through this screening of initial measures. Now, the list on the right-hand side of your screen is the list of all of the measures that we identified. And then after working through that planning iterative process, that circle on the left-hand side of the screen, we were able to screen out quite a few of the initial measures, and those that are highlighted on your screen are those that we brought forward. So 12 measures were moved forward to develop the alternatives. And what's shown here on the slide is our final array of alternatives. And I won't list or read through the measures since they're up here on the screen, but I do want to point out that the alternatives were formed in a stepwise process, starting with the base condition, being developed first, and the base condition attributes were then included in both the alternative 1 and 2. And for those who are not aware of the terminology, the base condition is essentially the continued channel maintenance and pile dike repairs using the existing placement sites that we have today. Alternative 1, we identified as a maximizing placement alternative. And alternative 2, we identified as a minimized dredging alternative. And this one really relies heavily on constructing new channel training structures like pile dikes. So how do we evaluate these alternatives? We use this model that is called Dredge Material Management Decisions, or D2M2. This model compares countless solutions and evaluates which versions even slightly outperform others. This provides an output of the least cost combination of placement sites. And there are several inputs that are necessary to run this model. Those include shoaling locations and volumes, placement site options and how much material they can hold, transfer site locations and their capacities, site details like cost, availability timelines, site constraints, etc. Routes are then identified between the potential dredging and placement site pairs to include transfer sites if applicable. And then the model identifies the least cost option of all of these factors. This here on your screen is a screenshot of what the model looks like. I understand it's a very busy visual, but it's a good demonstration of the potential combination of dredge areas and placement sites. There are a total of 69 dredge areas listed in D2M2, 193 final placement sites, and 23 transfer sites. Over 800 links are entered into the model. And as I mentioned before, the model identifies the least cost option of placement and anticipated dredge material over the next 20 years. And this is the alternative that the team will proceed with to take forward to environmental and cultural resources review.
Thanks, Sarah. I know we're going to pause for a minute to see if there are any questions yet. Nothing's been posted, but we can also take some time at the end. So if you think of something later, that's fine. But nothing so far in this last section.
Thanks, Kim.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the environmental and cultural resources review process. So beginning with NEPA and SEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, of 1969 is one of the nation's oldest environmental laws that encourages federal agencies to make environmentally responsible decisions. NEPA requires all federal agencies to consider and disclose the environmental effects of their proposed actions in an environmental impact statement. There is a citizen's guide to NEPA that explains this law and how to effectively submit your input if anyone's interested in looking into that. For this project, we are proceeding with a programmatic EIS, and some of the areas to be evaluated are listed here on this slide, such as water quality, recreation, historic and cultural resources. Also, to satisfy the requirements of NEPA and SEPA, the Corps and sponsor ports will be jointly preparing an integrated EIS for the plan. I will now turn it over to Lisa from the Port of Longview to share more on the Washington State Environmental Policy Act.
Thanks, Sarah. So SEPA is Washington State's version of NEPA, with some additional areas of evaluation, particularly around land use and local and state environmental regulations. The 20-year plan and placement sites include impacts to Washington State, and therefore SEPA evaluation is required. The intent for the NEPA is to be adopted formally in SEPA, with additional SEPA-specific appendices that will be incorporated into the draft and final EIS. The 20-year plan is being developed as a programmatic document, so additional phases of the plan will require SEPA evaluation over time. Based on our non-federal intergovernmental agreements between the ports, the Port of Longview is the nominal lead for SEPA, but Port of Kalama, Woodland, and Vancouver are also co-leads to the SEPA document. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. So collecting the right level of information at the right time is really important to developing this plan. And this requires early and frequent engagement with all the affected federal, state, and local agencies, affected Native American tribes, and interested groups and interested individuals. Here are a couple other environmental and cultural resources laws that we are currently working through. We are coordinating with the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries, or NIMS, for the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. The Corps is currently preparing the BA for the Endangered Species Act consultation with both NIMS and Fish and Wildlife. And we're also coordinating with NIMS for the Marine Mammal Protection Act compliance letter of authorization. The Corps is in consultation with Oregon and Washington SHPOs, tribes, and other interested parties under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And for the Clean Water Act, the Corps is meeting the compliance requirements for Section 404 through preparation of a 404B1 evaluation. And we're also working with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality and Washington Department of Ecology to comply with Section 401. The Corps is also coordinating with DLCD and DOE to work towards concurrence on a federal consistency determination under the Coastal Zone Management Act. And I've shared this slide earlier. I just wanted to reshare to highlight where we're at in the process, which is alternative formulation and analysis. That's where we're at today. And the next steps would be to release the report for the public for review. And that is expected later in this year at the end of November. Now, it looks like we do have some time to run through question and answers if there are any in chat at this time. And I think we probably have time to wait a little bit to see if folks have some to add.
That sounds good. We don't have any additional questions at this time, but we can wait since we're finishing a little early to see if folks do have some questions that they'd like to ask. We do have a question. How often is the sediment tested for COCs?
I'm sorry, I was stuck on mute. How often is the sediment tested?
Correct. For COCs.
I believe for VOCs.
Yes. COCs.
Oh, COCs.
Contaminants of concern, probably, or
Yeah.
something to that effect.
Thank you. Thank you. I believe annually, but I will, oh, I'm sorry, every 10 years.
Thank you.
And the results really are that we do have clean sand.
We have another one that's just come in, sort of on a related topic. The Portland Harbor Superfund site programmatic BA suggests that contaminated sediments may transport downriver into the Columbia River. Is that a concern for the Corps and the ports?
I'm sorry, you said in Portland?
Yes, I can read it again. The Portland Harbor
Sorry.
Superfund site, no, that's okay. I know it's hard. The Portland Harbor Superfund site programmatic BA suggests that contaminated sediments may transport downriver into the Columbia River. Is that a concern for the Corps and ports?
Yeah, I would say that would be considered in the sediment testing and evaluation plans. And so it's something that we will be writing about in the report would be, you know, water quality and other things included in the EIS. But I would imagine that is included in the sediment evaluation plan that the Corps has.
Yeah, and Sarah, this is Laura. Let me just also add. So the material in the Willamette River is a more clay, silty material, and as you all know, it is listed as a Superfund. And what happens is some of that material goes into suspension, and it's in the water column as it goes into the Columbia River. The main part that we're dredging, like Sarah's been saying, is clean sand, and so it doesn't have the ability for contaminants to adhere to the sand. Like if you think about being at the beach and trying to form something in the sand, you feel it different than if you're working in your garden and the clay sticky stuff is there. So in the part that we're evaluating for the Columbia River dredging, the clean sand part, we don't have a concern with contaminants. We have different requirements for our side channels, and each part of what Sarah was talking about is in this dredge material management plan that we do with the US EPA and the states. And they always are looking at, is there a reason for concern? And then the timelines are set based on prior sediment sampling and reason for concern. So other places where we do have silts, we test more often, but in the sand-rich environment for the Columbia, we do not. Over.
Thank you, Laura.
I just wanted to say a couple things before, everyone signs off. I mean, we'll take more questions if they come in, but I wanted to thank everyone for their time this evening. And as both Kim and I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we will be capturing the questions in chat and address these by general topic on our website, which you can see here on the screen. And we are holding a total of 5 open house meetings, which will all contain the same information. So there will be 2 additional meetings tomorrow. And there will be a recording of one of these meetings placed on our website as well. And if you have any additional questions that you can't think about during this meeting today, you can reach out to us at the Core Project mailbox listed here on the screen. And again, thank you for your time this evening.
Thanks. There aren't any additional questions at this point. So with that, we'll go ahead and end the meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, everyone.
Good job, everybody.